None of the major climate changes in the last 1,000 years can be explained by CO2.
We can't say that CO2 will drive climate. It certainly never did in the past.
Anyone who goes around and says that carbon dioxide is responsible for most of the warming of the 20th century hasn't looked at the basic numbers.
Now, one thing that kind of jumps out at you is, well, let me put it this way. If my classmate from the 6th grade that talked about Africa and South America were here, he would say, did they ever fit together? Most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. But they did, of course. And the relationship is actually very complicated.
So here we're looking at the ice core record from Vostok. And in the red, we see temperature going up from early time to later time at a very key interval when we came out of a glaciation. And we see the temperature going up, and then we see the CO2 coming up. CO2 lags behind that increase. It's got an 800-year lag. So temperature is leading CO2 by 800 years.
There have now been several major ice core surveys. Every one of them shows the same thing. The temperature rises or falls, and then after a few hundred years, carbon dioxide follows.
So obviously, carbon dioxide is not the cause of that warming.
CO2 clearly cannot be causing temperature changes. It's a product of temperature. It's following temperature changes.
The ice core record goes to the very heart of the problem we have here. They said, if the CO2 increases in the atmosphere as a greenhouse gas, then the temperature will go up. But the ice core record shows exactly the opposite.
This is the record of world temperature during the 20th century used by the IPCC. In the past 150 years, the temperature has risen just over ½ a degree Celsius. But the strange thing is, most of that rise occurred in the early decades of the 20th century, between 1905 and 1940, when industrial production was still relatively small. After 1940, as industry expanded, for some reason the world cooled. This cooling is even more pronounced in other temperature reconstructions. This graph shows temperature change in the Arctic during the 20th century. Again, most of the rise occurs before 1940. And again, during the post-war economic boom, the temperature falls and continues falling for 35 years.
Up until about 1940, it's warming, unrelated to carbon dioxide. Then there's a cooling or a flattening of the temperature. That can't be, you can't be getting a cooling from increasing carbon dioxide. And then there's the warming at the end of the 20th century.
Since the mid-19th century, the Earth's temperature has risen by just over ½ a degree Celsius. But this warming began long before cars and planes were even invented. What's more, most of the rise in temperature occurred before 1940, during a period when industrial production was relatively insignificant. After the Second World War, during the post-war economic boom, temperatures, in theory, should have shot up. But they didn't. They fell. Not for 1 or 2 years, but for 4 decades. In fact, paradoxically, it wasn't until the world economic recession in the 1970s that they stopped falling.
When the CO2 is increasing rapidly, but yet the temperature decreasing, CO2 began to increase exponentially in about 1940. But the temperature actually began to decrease 1940, continued till about 1975. So this is the opposite relation.
Temperature went up significantly up to 1940 when human production of CO2 was relatively low. And then in the post-war years, when industry and the whole economies of the world really got going, and human production of CO2 just soared, the global temperature was going down. In other words, the facts didn't fit the theory.
And the question again is, what caused this recent warming? So we run the model again and we include human factors.
Most of the rise in temperature occurred before 1940, during a period when industrial production was relatively insignificant. After the Second World War, during the post-war economic boom, temperatures, in theory, should have shot up. But they didn't. They fell. Not for 1 or 2 years, but for 4 decades. In fact, paradoxically, it wasn't until the world economic recession in the 1970s that they stopped falling.
In the summer of 1928, a bacteriologist working in London's St. Mary's Hospital by the name of Alexander Fleming was culturing Staphylococcus bacteria on a petri dish. A petri dish looks like this. It's got a sticky substance in the middle, and you put bacteria down, and they grow out in 48 hours on this agar plate, blood agar this is, and they grow out, and you can't see the bacteria, but you can see the colonies which they have created, the clumps of bacteria. So they grow out, and you grow all over the agar plate eventually. When he was doing that, and as Fleming was growing his Staphylococcus that summer of 1928, a colleague, another researcher, was growing what is called mold, or yeast, or fungus, same thing. He was growing mold. Here is an agar plate with mold growing on it. You see the fungus all over the plate being grown. Dr. Fleming took his staff. He was going away for his summer break. He took his staff agar plate and put it up on the top shelf of a secretary, a desk. The fellow who was growing the mold left his plate, both of them with the lids off, on the bottom, way below his, on a bench. They went off for their summer break. When they came back, they found out that they had left the window open and that a blowing curtain had knocked the petri dish with the mold, the fungus in it, down, upside down, on the open culture of bacteria. Now, Dr. Fleming looked in there, and he had the power of observation to notice that the dish with the bacteria now had mold growing in it. And wherever the mold grew, he noticed that there was a bald area the size of a dime where no bacteria grew at all. Now, he showed this to his colleagues. He said, look at the areas where that mold fell on my Staphylococcus bacteria growth. There's a bald area. There's a denuded area. He said, so what? Throw it away. You know, No, he says that means something. And he was astute enough. Dr. Fleming had the power of observation enough to know this mold is stopping bacterial growth. With that, he extracted what he called mold juice, and eventually tried it on other bacteria, always found out that indeed wherever the mold was dropped, the bacteria didn't grow. He eventually mass-produced it. He tried it on humans, and finally, in the early 1940s, beginning of World War II, the mold or fungus was being mass-produced, oddly enough, in America by a company in Peoria, Illinois. And because it looked under the microscope like a little pencil, it was called penicillin.
Now, we thought these were being killed with penicillin, and of course we urged the people to go to the doctor.
And of course, penicillin has changed the lives of all of us.
I mean, what's going on in the laboratory on the part of the drug companies? How are they going to fight back and create new kinds of antibiotics?
Okay, well, the old technique that they had, which was to take existing antibiotics and try and grow a slightly new strain, so a new variety of penicillin, right, and give it a different name, which worked fine for the first 30 years or so, has stopped working because the bacteria have outwitted all of these antibiotics.
In the early 1940s, beginning of World War II, it was called penicillin.
A new variety of penicillin, right, and give it a different name, which worked fine for the first 30 years or so.
In the early 1940s, penicillin.
Which worked fine for the first 30 years or so. Which worked fine for the first 30 years or so.
In the early 1940s, beginning of World War II, this was being mass-produced. And of course, penicillin has changed the lives of all of us.
A new variety of penicillin, right, give it a different name, which worked fine for the first 30 years or so, has stopped working